Welcome to the Jamesburg Presbyterian Church. Today is May the 25th. It is Tuesday in the year 2021. We are looking at the Gospel according to Mark, and today we're taking a look specifically at chapter 2 and the first portion of chapter 3 up to verse 19. Next week, which is June the 1st, we'll be taking a look at the rest of chapter 3 and all of chapter 4. And then each week after, I'm going to try to do 2 chapters at a time. It's an ambitious study. I may not be able to achieve that, and we may be revising as we go, but that's the intent. The study should end on July the 20th, give or take a week or 2 or 3. Anyway, good to have all of you here today. Do send comments to me if you would, so that I know whether we are meeting the needs of the Facebook and YouTube audience. I was talking about postmodernism yesterday with another group, and I'm wondering how in the world the deconstruction of the postmodern philosophy could be countered. Because postmodernism tends to deconstruct without making suggestions on how to solve societal's problem. It's a tear-down philosophy, get rid of, throw the baby in the bathwater away, without any kind of suggestions about what would replace the things we're deconstructing. And it occurred to me as I was doing the Bible study today, preparing for the Bible study today, that Christianity, or the Jesus movement, was a solution to the strict and rigid religious system that the Pharisees had put in place. And I'm toying with the idea that perhaps if we returned to a honest interpretation of Christianity, that could be the counter to postmodern philosophy. What we've drifted off to, I believe, is a culturally assimilated version of Christianity, one that even has returned to some pre-Reformation theology. The whole idea that we have to perfect our behavior to earn God's grace, rather than to see that God is a God that unconditionally loves us. So if we returned to the kind of teachings that Jesus teaches, that perhaps, just perhaps, we might be able to counter the deconstruction and destructiveness of postmodernism. It may not surprise you to know that there are many philosophers who are looking for the end to postmodernism, hoping that what follows is going to be better. Each cultural philosophy lasts for about 100 years, and we're not very near the 100-year mark for postmodernism. Depending upon when postmodernism started, some believe it began in the early part of the 20th century. Some people date it mid-20th century, but nonetheless, we're not at the 100-year mark for sure. Today, in today's installment, we are in chapter 2 of the Gospel according to Mark, and Jesus returns to Capernaum. And we're even given the impression that Capernaum is Jesus' new home. He, as you know, was originally from Nazareth. But what we're finding is, what we can infer from what is being said in Mark's Gospel, is that the people in Nazareth, that whole area there, know Jesus, and they're scratching their heads saying, "Who's this guy? I mean, we've known this guy since he was a kid, and there's no way that we're going to see him as a religious teacher with authority, let alone anything else. He's certainly not a prophet. We know him when he was playing in the streets. He was a nice kid and all, but no, I don't think so." So he's gone to Capernaum, and there he has found people who are listening to his teachings. What we're going to encounter in today's episodes is the questioning and a developing hostility towards his teachings. We're going to see the beginning of controversy having to do with what Jesus is saying. We're going to see him also growing in his popularity. People are coming from all over now to hear him and hopefully to get some sort of healing from him. We're going to see more and more the hostility of the Pharisees and Sadducees and Herodians in this particular episode. So chapter 2, verses 1 through 12 begin with a healing. Jesus is and by tradition, he is at the home of Peter. It's a small house at this particular point in time. Houses had shared courtyards, so maybe there would be 3 or 4 buildings, and inside that would surround an open space, and that open space would be used kind of like as a backyard, but various people would have in the backyard areas where they could cook and eat. It would be an extension of their living space. So it was easy for people to be at one home and see what was going on at another home. The homes were primarily used for sleeping and dressing and so on. So they were very small units, very small buildings. And apparently they had a kind of thatched roof. Anyway, Jesus is there. The crowd has pushed him into one of the buildings, Peter's house, presumably, and there are some people who have brought with them a paralyzed man, and he is being carried on a mat. So these men climb on top of the house, on the top of the building, dig up the roof, and lower the man down to where Jesus is. And Jesus sees this, and he says to them, he's amazed at their faith, and he says to the man on the mat, he says, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Whoa! Big explosion. Pharisees say, "Hey, buddy, who are you that you can forgive sins? Only God can forgive sins." So Jesus says to him, well, which is easier to do you suppose? Forgive his sins or tell him to get up and walk away? No one answers, so Jesus says to the man, "Get up, take your mat, and go home." And the man did. To break this down, this is a request for healing. The people are so desperate to get to Jesus that they dig a hole through the roof of someone's house. Now they're talking about having to have a roofing company come in and redo the house. Back in biblical days, people believed that these kinds of paralysis, these kinds of illnesses were the direct result of sin. And it would be, maybe you are not the one that sinned, maybe it was your parents, but somehow, somewhere along the line, somebody did something bad, did something evil, and now you are paying for that sin. And I think from time to time, we still believe this. Sometimes we'll say when bad things are happening to us, what did I do to deserve this? It maybe is meant to be a rhetorical question, but it reveals that underlying belief that we are still dealing with retributive justice. When you do bad, you get bad. I recently heard somebody say that about a problem that they were facing in life and said, I don't know what I did to deserve this, but I must have done something. So it does reveal that lingering belief that we are punished for bad behavior and rewarded for good behavior. So if life is going well for us, it's only because we have done something right to earn God's favor. That's not how life really works. Sometimes we get bad stuff in our lives just because bad stuff exists, and sometimes we get good stuff in our lives that we don't deserve, but we get it because that's how life is. So immediately when Jesus says to the man, "Your sins are forgiven," only God can forgive sins. That's true. But what Jesus says to the disciples is, how much harder is it for me to say, "Rise and walk away"? The reality is, this latter command reveals Jesus' powers to a greater degree than the acknowledgement of a forgiveness of sin. This is why Luke or Mark records this. It's not like we think it is, that Jesus is backing down when he says, how much harder is it to say rise and walk away? It's actually harder to say that from the belief system that is in place in this time period. So in many, this is an ancient a miracle story. It has the formatting of an ancient miracle story. People come, they show their faith in the person who can do the miracle. The miracle is done somehow, and then the person is told to go and go back to your home, go back to your family. Back in these days, when a person was paralyzed, there was no cure for it, so you're also a burden to your family. You can be isolated from society. People will see you as a huge sinner. No one will want to be affiliated with you, so they're not coming to visit this man, and he's only able to survive by the grace of his family and friends. So, and it may very well be that this man has had an accident. He still has friends who are willing to help him. If he was born this way, it might not be that case. So we can take from this story, the way it's told, some suspicions that this maybe has been some sort of accident for which there is no cure. Anyway, the things that Jesus says, your sins are forgiven, is clearly both a statement that belongs to God. In this time period, God is the one who can forgive sins. Later on in time, in the church, we will believe that the priests are connected to God and therefore can be the voice of God in when a person confesses to a priest, that the priest is able to say, go and sin no more. Your sins are forgiven. And that also comes from something that Jesus says to Peter at Caesarea Philippi. We'll get into that later on in the gospel according to Mark. So that's this particular story. Mark's readers are familiar with Jesus' authority to heal. This story portrays healing as evidence of Jesus' authority to forgive. If you can heal, you can also forgive. So that's the thing here. That's the irony of this story by Jesus saying, healing the guy. It already supposes that he can forgive the guy. An irony of how the story is told. Jesus leaves. He's out by the lake. The lake is the Sea of Galilee. It's the city of Capernaum is on the shore of the Sea of Galilee in the north end of that lake. And what happens here is he sees a tax collector. We are told his name is Levi, and his father's name is Alphaeus. That's important because later on we're going to see that one of the disciples is named James, the son of Alphaeus. So it's probably Levi's brother that becomes the tax collector, although some scholars believe it was Levi himself and his name has been changed to James. Anyway, Jesus says to him, "Follow me." Levi got up and followed him. Now, some things we need to know about tax collectors. First of all, tax collectors worked for the Roman government, and they would impose income taxes, they would impose property taxes, they would impose walk on the road taxes, they would impose I don't like the way you look taxes. They were free to do what they wanted. There was no set amount that was charged. Like if you had a donkey, that donkey was worth $10. You had to pay $10. That isn't how it worked. It was whatever the tax collector wanted to impose. Now here's the thing. The tax collector would get the job by saying to the government, every year I will give you X number of dollars. Now, that's a contract. The Roman government doesn't really care how you get that X number of dollars, as long as you get the X number of dollars and give it to them. If you fail to give them the X number of dollars, you could be imprisoned, executed, you could have all of your stuff taken from you, but certainly you will lose your job. Now, the tax collector doesn't just have to work to get X number of dollars. The tax collector could work to get X number of dollars plus as much else as he could get. He could become very wealthy. And not only that, I could get to the place, if I was a tax collector, where I was making enough money that I could hire people to do the taxation for me. So I don't even have to be out on the road collecting taxes anymore. I could have somebody working for me. I could buy somebody, a slave, to do the tax collecting for me. And once again, there's no set fee for anything. It's whatever I feel like imposing. So Levi might not have been the tax collector, if you know what I mean. He could have been a servant. He could have been a person working for somebody. We don't know that. We're not told that in the story. But we do know, we can suspect that Levi is the main tax collector because Jesus goes to his house and eats there, and it's a pretty lavish situation. Anyway, this Levi gives up what he's doing and goes to follow Jesus. Jesus goes to the Levi's house, and there are many other tax collectors there that have been invited, many other people, so-called sinners, that are there. And at this point in time, the Pharisees who are in the vicinity see what's going on, says to the disciples, what is wrong with this teacher of yours? He's eating with sinners and tax collectors. Jesus hears this. He knows what they're thinking. He hears what they're saying. And he says, I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. Here's the interesting question, and we can do a lot of playing with this. Is Jesus saying that the Pharisees are the righteous and he has no need to call them? Or is he being ironic here and saying that the Pharisees are also sinners and that he's there to call them as well? Is he implying that they're just as bad? You see, the Pharisees have gotten into a system. Here's the interesting thing about the Old Testament. The Old Testament has laws, for sure. But the laws are not specific on every single case of human life. What we have to do is interpret the laws and apply them to situations. The Pharisees will apply the laws any way they choose. If the law, if they need a more liberal application for themselves to get them kind of off the hook, they will do that. If they need a more judgmental application of the law, a more strict rendering of the law, and the interpretation will go against somebody. So the label sinner can be applied to whoever they want to apply it to as liberally and as deliberately as they want. And the idea is to exclude someone. Now, the original purpose of the covenant was to create a level playing field in which everybody could come together and be morally and ethically guided by a law so that everybody could be equal. That was the original intent of the law, bring a people together under one set of rules. However, in the time period in which Jesus is living, the law is being used to divide people. You either obey the law as I say you obey the law, or you are not worthy of God's love and acceptance. We're seeing this culturally, incidentally, in today, where there are people who can change the rules. You can get canceled out. Yesterday, you could have been part of the good old club, and today you got canceled out for something that you said or did that somebody doesn't like. And there are no written rules. It's just my interpretation of what offends me. And this is why I think that maybe the counter to postmodernism philosophy is a reenactment of Christianity, or a reinstatement of Christianity, a resurrection of Christianity, which is inclusive, if we could only do what Jesus teaches. In the latter part of chapter 2, Jesus is with his disciples. They're walking along, and apparently there are people following. There are people who are watching what the disciples are doing. And they have left their homes, so they're not near prepared food. It is the Sabbath, and as they're going along, they're picking some grain and eating it. This is how desperate they are to satisfy their hunger. They're eating grain seeds as they go along. This is granola times 10 in terms of hardness. And the Pharisees criticized Jesus, and why aren't your people fasting? Now, the interesting thing is that the Old Testament only requires one fast per year. That's on the Day of Atonement. The Pharisees fasted 2 times a week, every single week, which is way more than what they are required to do. So the Pharisees are once again imposing their values on Jesus. This is what we believe, why aren't you doing it? Well, Jesus doesn't happen to believe what they believe. And Jesus says to them, how can the guests of the bridegroom fast while the bridegroom is still with them? There'll be time to do that later. And then he goes on to say, no one pours new wine into old wineskins, because if you do, the wineskins will burst. No one sews an unshrunk piece of cloth onto an old garment. If you do, the new piece will pull away from the old. So you can't repair the old stuff by doing something new. And they continue to challenge him about this. Look what they're doing. This is unlawful to do on the Sabbath, picking grain. So Jesus says, David, king of Israel, went into the house of Abiathar, and ate the high priest, and he ate the bread that was consecrated for the priests and gave it to his traveling companions as well. Is that a blasphemy? Well, of course, they're not going to say anything negative about David. So the rhetorical answer is, no, that's not. Well, then how is what we're doing here a blasphemy? And Jesus says finally, and this is the most important thing about the Sabbath. Look, the Sabbath was made for people. People were not made for the Sabbath. Used to be back in the 20th century, in the mid-20th century, like in the 1940s and 50s, you couldn't go shopping on a Sunday. You couldn't go to the movies on a Sunday. You couldn't watch television on a Sunday. You couldn't do anything on a Sunday. And in certain places of the world where a Sabbath is particularly enforced, you can't cook food on the Sabbath. You can't even push the button on an elevator to get to the second floor, because that's considered work. Now, riding the elevator is not considered work. You just can't push the button to get to that floor. And the question that Jesus asks is the rules that you've made for the Sabbath, is that good for people? The Sabbath is going to become another issue in chapter 3. We'll see in just a moment. So the question is, what is required? And if we go back to what Micah says, justice, mercy, and walking humbly with God, that's all that's required from us. I'm glad we did that Micah Bible study some time ago. It's just those 3 things that are required: justice, mercy, and walking humbly with God. So Jesus' enemies are already plotting his death. And this dispute involves, first the dispute was, can you forgive somebody's sins? Well, how much harder is it for me to say, get up and go home? All right, get up and go home. There, did it. Now it's, can you pick grain and eat it on the Sabbath? Or do you need somebody else to come around, pick it so you can eat it? And can you eat the grain? You'd really have to do some serious chewing on that stuff. That's how desperate they were. Now, the law says you can do good on the Sabbath, and you can fulfill your hunger on the Sabbath. You can do things that are considered to be an emergency. So, is it an emergency to eat if you're famished? The Sabbath was designed for good behavior. So the overriding focus of these stories lies in the urgency of Jesus' mission to preach the kingdom. The disciples pluck the grain to eat because they are on the way to preach the gospel. They cannot remain at home where their food would have been prepared the previous day. Again, in chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, the whole issue has to do about doing good on the Sabbath. Jesus is in the synagogue, and they bring to him, or rather, Jesus calls out of the group a man who has an injured hand of some sort. In one version, it's called shrunken hand. The Greek for that could mean injured hand. It's interesting, there's a book called the Gospel of the Nazarene. And in that gospel, this story is recounted that the man was actually a stonemason, needed both hands to work. So in restoring his hand, Jesus was restoring him to his life. Here in Mark's gospel, it does not say anything about that, just that the hand is shriveled or seriously injured somehow. And Jesus said, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? Everybody remained silent because they knew the answer to the question. So Jesus says, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out and Jesus healed him. Of course, this is going to create a new level of hostility towards Jesus. When doing good is a matter of saving someone's life, no one would dispute the necessity of the action. If a person has a withered hand, that person might not have a life or death issue, but if the person's unable to work and provide for themselves and for their family, that could be a life and death issue for that person and the family. So Jesus does what he believes is the right thing to do in restoring this person to health. So the perceived offense lies in Jesus performing a miracle without a compelling reason to act on the Sabbath. This is what the Pharisees are coming up with. And that reading, of course, ignores the fact that Jesus does nothing to break the Sabbath rest. All he says is words. This is the irony. He doesn't stretch out his hand. He doesn't go over and rub the hand. He doesn't massage it. He doesn't put the bones back in place. All he does is says words, which is technically no violation of the Sabbath, although they take it as a violation of the Sabbath. So there's an irony here. Incidentally, Pharisees had no political authority during this period. They were often retained as advisors to people in authority. The Herodians were not a well-defined political group at this point in time, but they were considered to be the aristocracy of the Jewish people at that time. And some of them apparently did have access to King Herod, whose power in Israel is a question. How much power did he have? The Romans were in charge. They gave Herod it made him a kind of puppet governor. So the Pharisees and the scribes have apparently misinterpreted the law, or at least interpreting it to their advantage. In chapter 3, verses 7 through 12, we find that everybody is coming from everywhere to see Jesus, and so much so that they're actually pushing him out into the lake, crowding him out, and he's having to get into a boat to teach so that he can have some space. This is because of his reputation of healing people and of his remarkable teachings and interpretations. Everybody had to feel especially encumbered by Pharisaic interpretations of the law. You can't do anything on the Sabbath. You can't even feed yourself. You can't do anything good. The only thing you can do is rest and do nothing. And even that is going to get criticized by the Pharisees, who are always wanting to see themselves better than the everyday person by contrasting them and their stellar behavior to those around them. Final part of this chapter that we'll do for today, Jesus goes to the mountaintop. Mountaintops are always places to pray and get God's revelation. He takes with them 12 men that he has separated from the huge crowd of followers that he has, and these 12 men will become his disciples. And as I pointed out earlier, there is one who is called the son of Alphaeus, not Levi though, James. And the question becomes, is this the brother of Levi, or is this Levi whose name has been changed? We're not told. Mark may be continuing a tradition that Levi and James are one and the same person, but doesn't recount the fact that the name was changed. It's interesting that the last person listed is Judas Iscariot, and with the comma, who will betray him. So all the others are there listed as disciples of Jesus. Again, how we interpret the Bible is so very important. Do we see it as a book about guidance on how to love the world, the people in the world around us, or do we see it as something in which to slam a person's life because they're not living the way we expect them to live? That would be a very pharisaical way of approaching life, and it wouldn't be the Jesus way of approaching life, I don't think, at all. Jesus didn't come to condemn us. Jesus came to save us. And part of that salvation has to do with just faith in Jesus alone. Faith alone. God takes us where we start and takes us to beyond where we are. And that is the message that we should be promoting in our world today. The Gospel according to Mark is a fantastic book. I hope you will stay with me as we go through this Gospel in a pretty ambitious pace. Tomorrow there will be a devotional. I'm planning something really pretty cool. Hope you'll tune in. Stay well, stay safe, and thank you for being here today. Bye now.